The lamp had burned down almost to nothing, and I sat at the foot of the bed with my hands folded in my lap, because folded hands were the only thing I still knew how to do. It was the 7th year of our marriage. Downstairs, the clock struck 11, and my husband stood by the window with his back to me, and he said the words I had been waiting 7 years to hear him say, and dreading every single one of those years. He said, "It cannot go on like this, Anna. A man is owed sons." Before I tell you what he was allowed to do next, and what he did do for 11 Sundays, let me tell you who I am. My name is Anna. I grew up Old Order Amish, and I was married into a settlement in the same tradition, and I stayed inside that world until I was past 50. This is the channel where I say the things that were never said in my kitchen, never said in my church, never said by any woman I knew. If you want to hear the truth about Amish life from a woman who lived the whole of it, not a girl who left young, but a woman who stayed, please subscribe and press the like button. And tell me in the comments, from wherever you are sitting tonight, whether you have ever heard the word Barren spoken the way it was spoken to me. I read every one. I was 22 when I married Jacob. That was not young, not for a girl in my settlement. Most were married by 20. There were already whispers about me that I was particular, that I had turned down a boy or two, and a girl who turns down boys becomes a girl the boys stop asking. So when Jacob asked, my mother wept with relief before I had even given my answer. He was a good match. He had land coming to him, 40 acres, and a share of his father's herd. And he was steady, and he did not drink, and he had a laugh that filled a room. I want you to understand that from the beginning. Jacob was not a cruel man. Remember that, because it matters for everything that comes after. Our first year, I waited to be with child, the way every young wife waits. In my settlement, a bride was expected to be carrying by her first anniversary, and if she was not, the older women began to watch her at church, kindly at first. I remember the first time I noticed it. We were seated on the hard benches, the women on one side and the men on the other, and I felt a weight on the back of my neck, and I turned, and 3 of the older wives were looking at my waist, not my face, my waist, and when I caught them, they smiled and looked down at their laps, and I understood in that moment that I had become a thing to be measured. The second year, the watching changed. It grew quieter, and it grew heavier. There is a kind of kindness in our world that is really a kind of pressure, and I began to receive it in great quantities. A neighbor would bring me a tonic made of roots and tell me her grandmother swore by it. Another pressed a folded paper into my hand with words copied from an old German book, words I was to say over my washing water. An older woman took me aside after a Sunday meal and told me in a whisper that if I lay very still afterward and did not rise for an hour, it would take, as if my body were a stubborn seed that only needed the right trick to sprout. By the 3rd year, my own mother stopped asking me directly and started asking me sideways, the way our women asked everything. Are you eating enough, Anna? Are you resting? Have you tried keeping your feet warm? As if barrenness were a draft that came in under a door. And I answered her the way she asked, sideways, because the real thing had no words we were permitted to use. I would say, I am fine, Mother, and she would look at me a moment too long, and neither of us would say what we both were thinking, which was that a 4th year was coming, and a 5th, and that something would have to be done. Let me explain something to you about the world I lived in, because without it you cannot understand what my husband was permitted to do. In the old order, a woman's worth was not a single thing. It was built on pillars, and I have had years since to name them, though no one named them for me then. The first pillar was fruitfulness. A wife existed to bring forth children into the church. That was not one purpose among many. That was the purpose. A farm needs hands. A church needs numbers. A name needs to go forward. A woman who did not give children was not simply unlucky. She was in the quiet arithmetic of the settlement, a field that had been planted and did not yield. The second pillar was that the fault was always hers. This is the part that outsiders find hardest to believe. In all my years, I never once heard it suggested that a man might be the reason a marriage had no children. Never. The word we had was for the woman, barren. There was no matching word for a man because in our theology, a man could not be the empty one. If there were no children, the wife had failed. The soil was blamed and never the seed. And the third pillar was that a man wronged in this way had recourse. He was owed something. And the community, without ever writing it down, without ever saying it from the pulpit, understood what a righteous man was permitted to do, to try to set it right. That is what my husband meant when he stood at that window and said a man is owed sons. He was not threatening me. He was in his own mind, reminding us both of something the whole settlement already knew. Now here is what people outside do not understand. There was no paper for any of this. There was no rule I could point to, no page in the Ordnung I could read. It moved the way everything truly important moved in our world, sideways in silence, in what the old women did not say at the quilting frame, in the way the bishop's wife would touch my arm after service and hold my eyes one moment too long and then say nothing at all. I knew what was coming, the way you know a storm is coming, not from any word, from the pressure of the air. My friend Fanny had gone through it 4 years before me, though I did not know it at the time. She had been barren 6 years, longer than I had yet been, and the whole settlement had held its breath over her. And then one winter she was suddenly with child, and everyone praised God. And there was a great warmth toward her again, and no one ever said a word about the months before. I had thought, in my young ignorance, that God had simply answered her. I thought it was a miracle. I did not know there had been a girl in Fanny's house that whole year, a quiet cousin who did the milking, and then went away again once the child was born. I did not put it together. We were not taught to put such things together. We were taught to look away. But I had sat with Fanny in her cellar sorting apples the autumn after, the two of us alone with the lamp and the smell of the fruit. And she had gone very still with a jar in her hands, and she had looked at nothing, and she had said one sentence to me that I did not understand then and understood completely later. She said, "The counting is the worst part, Anna. Learn not to count." I asked her what she meant. Count what? And she came back to herself as if from somewhere far away, and she smiled. And she said, "The apples, never mind, count the apples." And then she went back to the sorting and never spoke of it again, not that day, not ever, not in all the years until she died. I have thought since that she was trying to warn me, that she saw my empty cradle and knew what was coming, and that one sentence in the cellar was the only warning she was brave enough to give. What happened over the next 11 Sundays, I cannot carry it in 20 minutes. There are things this recording cannot hold. The names, the counting, the drawer, the dress I kept for 27 years. 3 years ago, I finally wrote it all down. The book is called The Sundays. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Let me tell you what the recourse was, because you have waited long enough and it is time you knew. When a marriage bore no children, and the years had gone past what the community could bear, a man in my settlement was permitted to bring another woman into the working of his household, not a wife. We were not a people who took 2 wives, but a woman brought in to help, a younger woman, often unmarried, sometimes a widow, taken into the home to labor alongside the barren wife. And everyone understood, though no one said it, that her labor was not only in the kitchen and the garden. She was there to give the man what his wife could not, and any child she bore was raised as the wife's own, folded into the family as though the barren woman had borne it herself. And she was expected to be grateful. She was expected to thank God for the child, and to thank the girl who lay with her husband, and to raise that child at her own breast, and to never, ever speak of how it came to be. That is what my husband was allowed to do. And on that 7th year, standing at the window, that is what he told me he had decided to do. Her name was Mary. She was 19. She was a distant cousin of Jacob's from a settlement 2 counties over, a girl with no prospects of her own, plain and quiet and strong across the shoulders. And she came to us in the spring on the understanding that she was helping a household that had fallen behind. That was the story told at church. Anna is not well, they said. Anna needs help with the work. And the women nodded, and some of them looked at me with pity. And some of them looked at me with something worse than pity, which was recognition. They knew. They had watched this happen to others. A few of them, I understood later, had been the Mary in someone else's house when they were young. I want to be honest with you about those first weeks, because if I only tell you the pain, you will not believe the rest. Mary was kind to me. That was the thing I was least prepared for. I had braced myself to hate her. On the drive to fetch her, I had sat in the buggy beside Jacob and said nothing for an hour. And inside me, I had built a wall of hatred for this girl I had not yet met, because hatred was the only shelter I had. And then she came out of her father's house with a small bundle of her things tied in a shawl. And she was so young and so plainly frightened, and she would not meet my eyes. And the wall I had built simply fell down, because she was as trapped as I was. She had not chosen this any more than I had. Her family had many mouths and little land, and here was a household that would take her and feed her, and no one had asked her whether she wished to go any more than they had asked me whether I wished for her to come. She wept the first night in the room we gave her at the top of the stairs, the thin, small sound of a girl crying into a pillow so as not to be heard. And I lay beside my husband, and I did not sleep, and neither did he, and neither of us said one word. In the morning, I found her already up, the stove lit, the water carried, trying to make herself useful, trying to earn a place that had already been bought for a purpose she was too ashamed to name. And I could not hate her. I have wondered since whether it would have been easier if I could have. Hatred at least gives you somewhere to put the pain. I had nowhere to put mine, so I carried it in my chest like a stone. And I set another plate at the table, and I taught her how I liked the bread kneaded, and we became, God forgive us both, something almost like friends in the strange, slow weeks before the Sundays began. And then came the Sundays. It was on Sundays, when the work paused, that Jacob went to her. I do not know who decided it should be Sundays. Perhaps he did, because Sunday was the Lord's day and rest was permitted, and a man could disappear for an afternoon without the fields calling him. I only know that the first Sunday I understood what was happening. I took myself out to the garden, and I knelt in the dirt between the bean rows, and I pulled weeds that were not there, and I counted. I counted the minutes. And I remembered Fanny in her cellar telling me the counting was the worst part, and I understood her at last, and I have never in my life felt so completely alone as I did kneeling in that garden with my hands in the cold ground, counting. Learn not to count. I could not learn it, not for 11 Sundays. I am not going to describe to you what I do not need to describe. This is not that kind of telling. But I will tell you what it did to a marriage, because that is the truth nobody speaks. It did not make Jacob cruel to me. In some strange and terrible way it made him gentler, because guilt makes a certain kind of man tender, and he could not look at me without something breaking in his face. And I want to tell you that I hated him, and I did. On some of those Sundays, I hated him with a coldness that frightened me. But I also watched him carry that same grief, and I knew that he believed, truly believed, that he was doing the righteous thing, that he was repairing what God had broken, that the fault was mine, and he was being patient with my fault. That is the poison of it. He was not a monster. He was an obedient man in an obedient world, and obedience had told him this was love. The 11th Sunday, Mary did not weep that night, and 3 weeks later in the kitchen she caught my eye across the table, and she looked away, and I knew. Before she said a word to Jacob, before she said a word to anyone, I knew. Mary was with child, and here is the part I have carried the longest. The part that took me years in a room with an English woman who asked me gentle questions to even begin to say out loud. When Mary's child was born, a son, and they placed him in my arms and called him mine, I loved him. God help me, I loved him the moment I held him. He was not my son, and he was my son. I nursed him. I raised him. When the settlement praised God that Anna had finally been made fruitful, I let them believe it, because Mary let them believe it, because that was the arrangement, and we were both bound by it. And 2 years later, there was a second son, the same way, the same Sundays, the same silence, and I raised him too, and I loved him too, and Mary stayed in that house as a helper until she was old. An aunt who was not an aunt, a shadow at every meal, and we never once, in all the decades, spoke of what we were to each other. 2 women who had raised the same children and could not say why. I gave my husband sons. That is the sentence the settlement used. Anna gave Jacob sons at last, and every time I heard it, something in me went very quiet, and I thought of a 19-year-old girl weeping through a wall, and I thought of my own knees in the cold garden, and I let them say it, because to correct them would have destroyed Mary, and destroyed the boys, and destroyed the only family I had. When I finally left that world, long after Jacob had passed, long after the boys were grown men with children of their own, the English doctor I saw asked me about my history, the way they do, and when I told her this part, she set down her pen. She was quiet for a while, and then she said something I have thought about every day since. She said, "They made you raise the evidence of your own erasure and call it a blessing." And I did not have words for what those words did to me. Grief, yes. But underneath the grief, for the first time in my life, a clean and enormous anger. Not at Jacob, not even at Mary, my poor sister in that house, but at a world that could take two women and set them against each other over a thing that was never proven to be either one's fault, and call the whole arrangement holy. The old order gave me things I will carry to my grave, a community that came to every birth and every burial, that raised a barn in a single day when a family's burned, a faith with roots deeper than I can dig, hands that still know how to work, that found a kind of peace in labor the world outside does not understand. I do not tell you this story to make you hate the people who raised me. Most of them were good people caught in the same net I was caught in, believing the same things they had been handed, unable to see the water they were swimming in any more than I could. But there is no scripture I have ever found that names a woman a failed field. I have looked. In the years since I left, I have read the whole of the book they raised me on, cover to cover, in a language I could finally understand, and it is not there. There is no God I now believe in who weighs a woman's soul by what her body did or did not do, and hands her husband another woman to correct the ledger, and asks her to raise the correction and smile and thank him for it. That was not God. That was men, and the silence men build to keep women from comparing their wounds. Because if Fanny and I had ever been allowed to speak plainly in that cellar, if Mary and I had ever been allowed to say out loud what we were to each other, the whole arrangement would have cracked like ice in spring. The silence was not an accident. The silence was the machine. And every woman kept quiet in it was keeping the next woman quiet too, without ever meaning to, without ever knowing she was doing it. If you were ever measured by what your body could produce, and found wanting and told that the wanting was your sin, I see you. If you ever raised a child whose beginning you were forbidden to speak, I see you. If you ever knelt somewhere in the cold and counted minutes you were not supposed to count, I see you most of all. You were not a failed field. You were never soil. You were a whole person the entire time, even in the years they told you otherwise. Leave me a comment and tell me what part stayed with you. Tell me your own story, if you are ready to tell it. And if you want to keep hearing from behind the prayer cap, subscribe to this channel, because there is so much I have not yet said. The Sundays. What 20 minutes cannot hold. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. The morning is yours, if you decide it is.